All right, good afternoon, everybody. The last session of what's becoming quickly my favorite conference of the year, of Xamarin Developer Summit, right? Yeah, because everybody here are mobile developers, my type of people. This is great. So today we are going to be talking about a little bit of mobile development, a little bit of cloud development, a little bit of both. It's going to be partly cloudy, right? We're going to be talking about little tips and trips about making Azure and mobile work together great. So my name is Matt Sokup. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, and that's a pretty weird title to have. And so what is cloud advocacy? In short, it means I heart developers. I love going out and talking to everybody. I make podcasts, do the Xamarin podcast. I do videos, a lot of blogs, a lot of articles. But most importantly, I advocate for you all within Microsoft itself. So I want to make sure your voice is heard to the product teams. So if you have any issues with any products, you have any ideas, you just want to have some code reviews, feel free to, my DMs are always open on Twitter. I have office hours, aka ms/office-hours. It'll open up my calendar. You can schedule time with me. We'll sit down for a half hour, anything you want to talk about, from how to get into public speaking, to some debugging, to some issues. I can bring them back to the product team, make sure your voice is heard within Microsoft. So, with that said, how many people have ever written an app that has not talked to some sort of internet API at all? One person. Two people. Me too. My very first app I wrote was for a zoo in Madison, Wisconsin. And what it did is that when you stood in front of an exhibit, it talked to the GPS, so I guess it was space enabled. It went out to the GPS satellites, and it brought up, say you're standing in front of the bear exhibit, it brought up information about the bears, which probably was the same information on the sign that you're standing right next to, but it was information that was, everything was built right into the app. Images, text, and everything. Not a cloud in the sky right there. But as we started growing, we had to figure out how we were going to move beyond having everything just packaged right into the app. More than just that. And so how do we do it? Well, of course, you find your friend who works at a ISP, ask him if you can take a server and put it right in the rack, and you make that server have IIS on it, SQL Server on it, and you put some images, probably right in SQL Server as blobs, and you serve it all from that. And you have a 100% tuned back end because you know exactly how it works. You know all the nooks and crannies of it. It's going to be working perfect for you, right? It works so perfect that you're programming in binary for it. You know it back and forth. Problem is, you're going to outgrow that back end very quickly. And I mean, you're serving files from SQL Server. That's not going to last very long at all. And eventually, you're going to hate your life. And so you're going to start looking up for the cloud and Azure and all these products that have these weird logos to it. What do they mean? And there's literally hundreds of them. And the problem here is that it's not so much knowing about them or knowing in depth, it's knowing about them. What do things do? And knowing the tips and tricks about them. Like how to use them in a mobile context. And so you can go to the docs, you can go to blogs, you can go to what's Microsoft Learn, and I'll touch on that just for a second. But you don't even know what you don't know in certain instances, and sometimes using one Azure service in the context of web is totally different when you're using it for mobile. So, with that said, and that's what we're going to talk about today, though, is using several Azure services in the context of mobile, just some tips and tricks about it. But I do want to talk about one thing, and that's Microsoft Learn. And so what Learn does, if you listen to the Xamarin podcast at all, is that James and I made a joke about it. It's 100% free, is that it has both Xamarin content on it, to Learn, the successor for Xamarin University, and also a lot of Azure content as well. So what you can do is follow this aka MS link, and what it does is step-by-step tutorials. You're actually able to new up sandbox portions of Azure to it, and so as you go through the tutorial, you're typing and creating services and learning as you go. So it's actually pretty cool. So Just waiting for some photos, and we're off. So the things that we're going to talk about today, some tips and tricks, are going to deal with security of your apps. So what I'm going to call auth and auth, authentication and authorization, and then performance, how to make things run faster in the cloud. All right, first off then, security. This is one of the only not hand-drawn slides I have because it is that important. Security, very important topic. Let's say you have an app. It's the world's greatest weather app. It's stick figures, and what you have there is call out to a weather API service, and it brings out, if it's partly cloudy, brings out a cloud with a little stick figure sun, right? Partly cloudy. Happens to be the name of the talk. It fits in perfectly. It's wonderful. Problem is, it has this very expensive third-party API key that you have to call to the weather service with, right? So what do? Well, hard code it in. Why not? Well, the problem is that you might have somebody who decompiles your app, Android, right? You lose your API key. Then maybe you have to cycle that API key. If you have it hard-coded, you're going to have to redeploy the whole app, and that's a pain. Even if you're just deploying it within your own company, even if it's just internally, just having to do a deploy for cycling an API key, that's a big issue. And then there's also what I'm going to call credential passing. And this is what I mean by credential passing. It's something that we don't want to really have to do. Let's say this is you. You're happy, right? Sole developer, you have your API keys, you're hard-coded all over the place, big deal. Life is good. You bring on 3 more happy faces. How do you get them the keys to your app? Well, if you're like me, you're going to check them into GitHub and not worry about it. However, you might want to email them, Slack channel them, or whatever. 4 people, not too bad. You're doing great. You're a bigger team now. You have 13 people. How do you handle the credential passing? It gets even worse, right? So the issue comes on like more and more. It's not a good deal. How do you handle credentials to like one backend service? And even worse, we're remote teams. People are working from coffee shops. Let's say it's not just an API key, your database service. Somebody's at a coffee shop, they get up and leave, another person takes a snapshot of their screen. You also have a big database breach. And in case you're wondering who did that database breach, Steve. You can never trust Steve going out to coffee shops. Anyways, Azure Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault is one of those things that you don't want to use it locally. We just want to use it up in Azure. So let's take a peek at what we're going to do and how we can actually use it up in Azure. All right. So before we get into it, I want to show you the app that we're going to be demoing with for the rest of today. And so it'll come up on here. All right, so it's going to be a clone of the Microsoft News app. And so it actually is I'm really proud of how this looks. It's using Shell, it's using material, or visual material. It's coming through. We actually have collection view here as well. And I can go in and or collection view is actually on this one, I'm sorry. You can actually go in then and sign in. It'll call to Azure B2C. And I will log in. And please, if you ever have any questions, email me here. And if you ever want to get into my banking account, it's ABCD1234 exclamation point. ABCD1234 exclamation point. Log in, and then back to the star. And one thing you can see is that for my products, I'm interested in these certain things, products, science and tech, and so on. So this is a news app where I can just go through and say, all right, I'm interested in products, I'm interested in science and tech. So I'm just going through and saying, hey, I'm interested in it, let's save it. It's going to go through it's going to follow me around on my different devices, so to speak. Logging in with B2C, setting the stage for certain things that we're going to use. And this, as I mentioned, the news is actually coming down with Microsoft Cognitive Services News Search. It has an API key. All right, so that's what we're playing with today. Here's what the news search looks like right now. It's just calling out using the NuGet package for news search, and I have a Bing API key right here, right there. I just leaked it. Everybody here knows it. It's on the live stream. Everybody, like I'm sure there's 10,000 people watching right now. The entire world knows my API key. So I want to get rid of it. I want to cycle it around. And so the first thing I want to do is I don't want to have this all locally, right? So I'm calling out to Azure anyway to get it. So a better way to do this would be to call through functions. And so calling out to Azure Functions does a couple things for me. One, it lets me essentially hide that API key up in Azure. And so before I start talking about it, so my Azure Functions really here is, you can see in my, here I just have things like get top news, get news by category, and so on. In my Azure Functions, I just recreated that. Get top news, get news by category. It's the same thing, I just moved them up in the functions. One function for each thing I'm doing. So then in my resources here, up in Azure, make that smaller. And how are we doing on, can people see in back? Good. Silence means everything's perfect. So I will go here, and then up here in Azure, I have my functions deployed. And one of the things you'll note here is when I go and get my functions, when I new it up, get top news, I'm pulling in this news search key. This news search key is coming from my configuration. I'll make this a little bit bigger as I scroll down. News search key right here. All right, so things are a little bit more secure right now, and that's a little bit better. Or I'm just having my API keys up here in Azure, right? It's okay. I mean, it should be secure. It's only limited to people who can actually get up there with my account. It's a little bit better. It's not the greatest, though. And so what I want to do is putting this into Azure Key Vault. And so what is Azure Key Vault then? It pretty much does exactly what it sounds like. It's like highly encrypted things where you put your secrets. You can put secrets, certificates, keys, and so on into it. And what you can do with this is restrict access to whatever you want to have access to within it. So a secret is actually what your API keys would be. It's like a string. And so what I want to do is go back to my constants, copy that out, and I'm going to put a new one in here. So I'm going to call this Bing-news, copy the value into it, and then create it. All right, so I was going to create the Bing News thing. I'm going to be able to go in here, and it comes with a URL, a secret identifier that I can go and copy in for it. And I could also version this around too. So if I ever leak my key, which I did several times, I can create a new version for it as well here. Great. So what I'm going to do then is go back into my function. So within my function, I'm going to go to the edit, and instead of having this, I'm going to say Microsoft.keyvault, A-U-L-T, secret URI equals that value. So now it's saying, all right, Azure function, go talk to Key Vault and get it. But I still have to do one final step, and that's actually give the Azure function access to it. And that's done through this thing called identity, managed server identity, which is as simply as going, set it on, and save, and then let it go. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually saying to Active Directory behind the scenes, which you get every time you create a subscription for in Azure, I'm saying, hey, Active Directory, make my function like an entity in here. Make it like a person. So I can actually go through and give it permissions to my Key Vault. So I went through and it says, all right, we're all cool. Back to the dashboard, over to Key Vault, and then I can go to access policies. So right now, I'm the only one who could go and read Key Vault, but I can go and add new. I'm going to go to secret management, because that's where all my API keys are, and then select principal, And once that loads up, it's going to be XAM dev summit dash function, and it should go around, and it's going to take a little bit to come through, so I'm going to try it one more time. We'll refresh and come back in. That's fine. Of course, it takes just a little bit, so I'm going to back out, go back in, and if it doesn't work this time, we'll pretend it just did. Back to access policies, add new, secret management, select principal, XAM, dev, summit, function. Of course, it doesn't show up. All right, it will be there in just a couple seconds. So what I'll go back then into here is for my Bing news service. I'm not going to use that locally any longer. I'm going to go over to I'm going to have a functions news service. So this is in my core portion of Xamarin Forms. And what I'm going to do here is just go over and call my functions. And I'm using a refit all the way at the bottom here to actually do it. So I'm just saying whack get news by category or get top news, return everything, and populate that way. So let's see if it actually came through yet. There it is, XAM Dev Summit.scus. Select secret permissions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It really only needs get, but I'm going to give it all just so nothing like going overboard. So it has everything it needs right now. I'm going to just double check and I think I typed something in wrong, so I'm not going to play around with it too long. So what I did here is I must have mistyped my at Microsoft. So I'm going to grab it from a different one. And retype it in. So I have it. Updating web app settings. And once this saves, good. And then when I go back to Postman, it should be good here, loading. Good, we have our stuff back so I can reload my app. And now it's using functions instead of local, and I have my key vaulted API key. So now I could cycle it if I needed to. So it's just way more secure. So I'm not holding any API keys on device any longer. And this will be really good as far as when it comes to connection strings as well when we get to that. You don't want to have any database connection strings locally if you can avoid it. All right. Do you see that one? Apple's killing the notch. Look at that. Who would have guessed? Anyways, here we go. Auth and auth, authentication and authorization. All right, so authentication and authorization really are two different things that go hand in hand, right? There is the authentication part of it, who is, I am who I am, and here's my backing ID credentials who says who I am. And then there's the authorization part, who's the guy who says, no, either you can or you can't come in, right? Here's who I am, and here's what I want to do. And so Azure has really two parts of it. We have Azure Active Directory B2C, which you can think of as a core. There's an Active Directory core to it, and then there's a bunch of identity providers that sit around it. So the identity providers really do a lot of things by saying, here's who you are. Twitter, you can log in, and Twitter can vouch, all right, this is CodeMail Matt. Or you can use GitHub to vouch for, yeah, this is CodeMail Matt, which then has a backing person in Active Directory. All right, so Active Directory B2C here is kind of like an abstraction over all those identity providers. But it's still the who, right? And in our apps, we use MCell to get to it, Microsoft Authentication Library. This is all fine. This works great. The problem is that it works very tricky. It's low level. It can be hard to set up. I have a 13-part blog series on using B2C with MCell, and I could easily write 10 more parts on it. Identity is tough. It's really, really tough. So enter App Center. If you all haven't tried App Center's authentication piece yet, give it a shot. It has a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful API surface to it. It wraps up MCell. It still uses MCell underneath the covers. It wraps up MCell. It still uses B2C. It just gives us a little better API surface for it. So you would use MCell if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, but if you don't need to, you would use App Center. But that's only giving us the who. It's not giving us the what can I do yet, right? And so the tip and trick here is, how do we figure out what we can do? So on the app, the what we can do part was the saving our preferences of what news functions we wanted to look at, the product, the science and technology, that type of stuff. And so I'm using Cosmos DB as my backend. And so you can think of how Cosmos stores its stuff. It stores it as a NoSQL database, right? So we have most of our data is pushed away in this big JSON blob. But there's a couple other portions of Cosmos as well. There's this ID column that's there, and then there's this partition. And this partition really, I think of it as sitting kind of separately. It kind of doesn't, but it kind of sits separately. And we can use that as a little bit of a security thing. Because ideally what we want to have happen is we don't want to have our connection string for Cosmos sitting in our client that has absolute super user rights to it. Because then I would be able to get at somebody else's data, or you'd be able to get at my data if there's maybe a bug in the system or something like that. So we want to be able to get at only one user's data at a time. So ideally, we want to be able to have Cosmos come back, and instead of us sending it the connection string, we want to have Cosmos tell us a particular string for us to operate with. So essentially, we want Cosmos to give us a token, and that token is able to say, all right, Matt, you only have access in this connection to hit user one's data. User one's data is in this partition. So how do we go about doing that? With all of these arrows. I wrote the Microsoft Docs getting started with Cosmos DB on Xamarin, and we could not put this in because all those arrows. And there's a big blob right on top of it. It says, don't put your connection string in the app because all these arrows. But yet this is essential to when you want to connect to Cosmos on device. You really should do it this way. And I call it the broker pattern. And so here's what it's doing, is I'm already assumed that you have logged in with B2C. You have the credentials of saying who I happen to be. So number one, you're going to go up to this broker in the cloud somewhere, whether it's a web API, whether it's an Azure function, and you're going to be giving it your token, your credentials, saying, here's who I am. The broker is going to take it and is going to say, okay, let me check this out. It's going to go over to B2C and say, here, do you trust this? B2C is going to give it the thumbs up. Cool. And then with number two, it's going to go to Cosmos and say, okay, how should we handle this? Here's who we are. And this is our app logic then saying, okay, let's do this on a partition. So in Cosmos's case, in our case right here, we're going to partition it out and we say, for this user on this auth token we get, we're going to say, auth token for this particular user's partition. Pass that back with number 3, and then pass that back with number 4. So now we have this particular token that when we new up our Cosmos client on device, that it's only good for that partition. So in step 2, when we're creating that token, we could actually create it for just one single document if we wanted to. So there's nothing saying that we have to create it for the entire partition. That's just what we happen to be doing in this use case. That's our app logic. Number 2 is how we want to do it, how much we want to give to the user. But this is something that we should always be doing when we connect to a database, is don't connect with a connection string. Let's connect with a token that gives the least amount of privileges possible. So let's check out a demo on how that's going to happen. All right. So let me shut down all the windows here. And so right now, I'm connecting with the Cosmos data service. Cosmos API key in my document client. So this is just the document client, the straight up the Cosmos NuGet that I'm using in here. And I want to move that over. I don't want to use that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different one. And that's going to be called Cosmos Partition Service. So the only thing different in this Cosmos Partition Service, all the gets of data and everything else are going to be exactly the same because I'm using document client. All I'm doing though here is I'm going to be calling a function to go get my data, my token. And that function here is underneath this. And there's a lot of creation for Cosmos functions or Cosmos tokens. So I'll give you the GitHub URL for all this, but essentially what it's doing is just going out and creating a bunch of permissions for this particular user based off of this claims principle that's coming in and passing it back. But one thing I do want to note, this is an Azure function, and it's operating off of HTTP trigger that's firing. It's taking a claims principle on the input on the function. So it's saying, all right, I need to be hooked up to a claims principle, but tokens coming into it. So this is new in functions 2.0, and that we can actually say, hey, claims principle right there. And then it's saying, hey, Cosmos DB, I'm hooked up to here too, just by the input. So I don't have to actually new up a document client here at all. Everything's done for me. It's taken care of by Cosmos. So that's just, or by functions. That's just a neat thing going on. So, all right. Now what I'm going to do first then is, before we call that Cosmos, is I'm going to swap out to App Center. So I want to show you what we have currently for our authentication with MSAL. I'm not going to walk through it. It's just that this is all the code that we need to use to talk to B2C. That's a lot of code. And I'm not doing anything special. Let's use App Center instead. Oops. All right, here we go. App Center. It always has a really pretty UI as far as I'm concerned. So what I'm going to do first is connect to my Azure subscription. Over conference Wi-Fi, and here we go. This is my subscription. Hit next. Now I already have a B2C tenant set up because that's how I was working before with my MSAL. So it's going to ask me which one I want. This one happens to be XAM Dev Summit B2C. Next. Which application? Partly Newsy. Next. Which scope is in there? Newsy. So I've already set all these up as I said before. So it's just kind of walking me through what I've already did. So you still have to do this. And then finally it's saying which sign-in policy do I want? And sign-in policies are your user flows, which is this B2C1 sign-up. And that's the only thing that it doesn't bring in for me. Hit connect. I grant access to it. That's it. I have now connected App Center to B2C. There's one other thing I need to do before I can make it actually talk to it, and that's change my info plist. So on the reason I have to change my info plist is because whenever it calls out and logging in cell, it brings up a web view, right? And that web view then enter your username, password, and it calls back to the web app. And so I'm putting in the URL that it's going to call back to, essentially. And so App Center uses a different URL than mcell did. So that's this what I'm just setting up. So one question that I get asked a lot is, do I need to show that web view all the time, that thing that shows up? No, you don't need to show it, but please, 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 please always do. You don't want to get in the business of handling your users' passwords. That web view takes care of all this security for you. Essentially, when you start handling your users' passwords, you become a man in the middle. You have put a security hole in your app by handling your user's password. You got to store it and then pass it yourself. So let that web view do it. It's an operating system feature that lets you not have to worry about passwords. So use it, please. Cool? All right. So anyways, so now we have authentication services out, and then now App Center off service. This is all I need to do to sign in. All this right here is just me doing some storage. This is just to sign in. That whole file before was to sign in. This is what it is now. That's crazy. This is what it is to sign out. It's much, much easier. So let's run this, and I'm going to set a breakpoint, make sure my Cosmos partition service is set up. Cosmos data service commented out. And let's actually do this. Clean it. Delete it. And the reason I'm doing this is just to be sure the everything is clean from the last time I logged in, because I don't want to have any tokens laying around. And here we go. No reference. All right, how about I go back to XR? Oh, I know what I did. App Center. All right. And all right, so here I go. I'm going to log in, and it's right now it prompts me. So this is part of what App Center is doing. Before, when I tried to log in, I didn't get this pop-up and say, hey, you're trying to sign in. All right, cool. Brings me in. And because it's the same one as before, I can use my username and banking password again, ABCD1234, exclamation point. And then I should go over here, and then this will come out, should hit Cosmos in a second. I can see this is the Cosmos token. So this will only be available for a certain amount of time, and it's only going to allow me to hit my particular partition that I want to hit. And so that way, if I have any bugs in my code, I don't have to worry about anything at all. Very cool. And then this is always interesting to look at. This is a token that came back from App Center. I'll just let this run. And so this is the App Center token. It just tells me who I am, essentially. So me. And I ran on this thing, the newsy. So cool. And my app is up and running. All right. So the moral of the story here is only connect to databases with tokens. And App Center here has a beautiful API. And if you could get away with it, if you don't need to use the low-level stuff that MCell gives you, try using that. Try using the App Center API. It's sign in and log out. Sign out. All right, performance then. Let's make our stuff faster. And the whole key with performance when you're dealing with the cloud is to bring your data closer to the users. So you can have your data center here. Everything that I've been showing you here so far has been set up in the South Central US data center, which I believe is in the Dallas area. But if somebody is over in Europe, it's going to be a little bit slower for them. So we want to make it faster. How do we do that? Well, if we have blobs, there's a super easy way to do that, and it's just wrap it in a CDN. Well, I'll show you how to do that real quickly. So what a CDN is going to do, I'm sure we're all familiar with that from the web days, it's a content delivery network. It's great for static resources, and if we're using blob storage on Azure, it sets up super, super quick. So wrap it in a CDN and serve everything from a CDN. Everything is going to serve from the Azure edge at that point. Secondly, to talk about Cosmos. Cosmos lets us do reading and writing from many different locations across the globe, and it's really a matter of just clicking on a web page to set up more read and write regions. And so the way this is cool and the way it works is that Cosmos itself has a traffic manager. You're going to get when you set up a Cosmos instance, you get a URL. That URL sits in front of a traffic manager. So it's going to be like, say, Matt's cool Cosmos instance documents.azure.net, something like that. I'm issuing a request against it. It first hits a traffic manager, sees that I'm sitting in Europe somewhere, and it's going to route me to my closest Cosmos read region that I had set up. Cool. Everything's working as I would expect if I'm just accessing Cosmos from my app. However, I had that permissions function, which was accessing Cosmos for me, and if that's set up in South Central US, that's going to take a little bit longer then. If I'm sitting over in Europe, I have to go route to that, and then routes back to me. So the question is, how can I make my functions work faster as well? And there's something called Azure Front Door. So Azure Front Door really is a global entry point for all of our web APIs that we write, whether these are hosted on Azure or not. So what we do is we define routing, and these are going to be URL matched. And these routing then is going to allow us to say where we want these to go. And it comes with a pretty cool GUI editor, which we'll get into. And what it does allow us as well as seamless failover. So I can have one, let's say, Azure function spun up in South Central US, another one somewhere over in Asia. If the one in here, South Central US, goes down, the one in Asia will take on all the traffic for me. I don't have to do anything. It'll just seamlessly do it. And it's all SSL terminated as well. So SSL termination meaning that my SSL is taken care of by the Azure Front Door server, and my web app or function server is not getting overloaded and having to do SSL decryption and everything else. Front Door is going to take care of it for me as well. And this all sits on the Azure Edge too, meaning that a web request is not going to have to route through the whole Azure system to find the one that's sitting, let's say, in Asia. It's going to get this URL that sits over on the Azure Edge, which is going to be optimized for quick response. All right, CDNs and front doors. All right, the CDN then. Azure Storage. In here, I have the blobs that we show underneath the for the categories in the grid view. So what I want to do here is wrap that in a CDN to make it work a little bit faster. So all I have to do is type in Azure CDN. It's right in there for you and create a new one. So I'm going to just do Xamarin Dev Summit -CDN. That name is not taken. Looks good to me. And then the pricing tier. So what's offered on several different pricing tiers from standard Microsoft or Verizon and Akamai. Standard Microsoft usually works just fine. Then the endpoint name, that one's also good. So it's going to be xdscdn.azureedge.net. Create it. And it's going to go through, it's going to create it and push it out to all the CDN points around. So what I want to do here then is go into, stop this, my models class and make sure that's updated. And I called it XDS-CDN. Xamarin Dev Summit-CDN. All right. Cool. Our images will be served from a CDN next time we run the app. Next thing up is front door. All right. I'll just open up a new portal. All right. So what I have done, everything here is being served from South Central US, my 2 functions. I've already then repeated things, so I have 2 coming from Japan East and also West US 2. And so what I want to do is put these into a front door. And so I mentioned front door has a pretty neat UI designer with it. And so what I'm going to have here is xam-dev-summit.azurefd.net is now going to be my new URL front door for everything. All my requests are going to now go to that URL. Then, for anything that ends with API/news, I'm going to route that to this back-end pool called news. That back-end pool called news then is going to have this SCUS function in it, but I'm going to add more. And I can add an app service. And in that then, that's US. I'm going to add my one in Japan. Add it. And I'm going to add another app service. And now I want to get the one in West US 2 function. Add that. Function, update. And the same thing over for permissions. Everything for permissions, API/permissions, goes to my permissions backend pool. For my permissions backend pool, then I already have the one for SCUS, new backend service, app service. It's going to go to Japan East, permission, add, and then new backend service, app service. Permissions West US. And so what this is doing here, I can also do other things. I can give it a priority and a weight to tell me, I want this West US one always favored. Something like that. Add that as well. And then it's always going to be shooting off health probes as well. So if one goes down, it's going to automatically exclude one of these backends for me. Update it. Save it. And then now this is going to push everything out to the Azure Edge for me as well. So as that is going through, I'm going to go over to my constants. Comment all those out. Now these are my functions that I'm using. And they're now xam-dev-summit-azurefd.net. And so updated the front door. I'm going to assume my CDN is there. Great. So before I run this, I will note that CDNs are notoriously slow to update to the CDN, so we probably won't see any images, but we should be running against the Azure front door. So By not seeing any images, we should know that the images are on the CDN. So I just set it up for failure, right? By it not working, it's going to work. And here we go. We hit our database. We hit our database. I'll remove that breakpoint. And then, so everything came down from the front door. And actually, I'm going to try something for the first time. I'm going to change my VPN over to Tokyo. So I want to actually see if it comes through Japan, because it should come through in Japanese then. It's going to make me log in. So believe it or not, my Microsoft password is not ABCD1234. So, all right. I will try this afterwards, though, to see what happens. All right, so with that said, there's a couple of just key components here that we went through. One is security with Key Vault. You don't want to have your users have the credentials. What you can do is put things up in Key Vault, and then they have a URL that they can hit at there. Ideally, your API keys are even sit into an Azure function itself, and then the users just call that. Couple that with a little authentication so they know who they are, and then the functions know who the users are, and it's even better. Cosmos. Who you are, what you can do. Always connect to a database with a token if you can. Cosmos gives you a great way with partitioning as well to make that so you can only say who can get what. And then for performance, move your data as close to the user as you possibly can with CDNs and with Azure Front Door as a way to partition your functions out and as a way to say wherever you are in the world, route it to the closest one based on the IP addresses that come through. So with that, all the code and slides will be at that, aka MS link, xds-partly-cloudy. And I'll also put in some further, essentially we're going to be deeper dive blogs onto the READMEs as well that go into this a little bit deeper that we couldn't get into. So with that, iHeart developers, please reach out for anything that you have, any questions at all, whether it's about this, about something else, about Kubernetes or Docker or anything else. I know people who know about it who can help you out with anything at all. So let me help you get your voice heard within Microsoft. Thank you very much.